Chief Adebayo Balogun lifted his cut-glass flute, the champagne bubbling under the golden light of the chandeliers, and announced with a calculated chill that his daughter would lose every single kobo of her inheritance. He let the words hang in the air, ensuring everyone present understood this would happen. If she continued to see Emeka Okoro, the single father whom everyone in that room had already decided, with sidelong glances and venomous whispers, was far beneath her. Stifled laughter rippled through the grand hall like a perfectly rehearsed performance, a symphony of mockery masked as elegance. Funke Adikole, the chief's sister, smiled. It was the sharp smile of a woman who believed she had just crushed the final obstacle between her and the incalculable Balogun family fortune. Adesewa did not flinch, did not lower her gaze, and did not show the slightest trace of regret. Instead, she reached out and held Emeka's hand firmly, intertwining her fingers with his in front of all the people who supposedly mattered in Lagos high society. What none of those pompous guests knew was that the quiet man in a simple, functional jacket that clashed with the expensive, flowing agbadas, controlled ports, railways, power grids, and a monumental fortune that made the Balogun Empire look like a mere rounding error. By morning, the family that had delighted in humiliating him would discover exactly who they had so arrogantly chosen to lose. It had all started months before, on a platform slick with the relentless rain of the wet season, where a century-old transit station in Apapa was being demolished to make way for a modernization project. Adesewa Balogun, at 36, was the managing director of the Balogun Logistics and Haulage Group, and she was exhausted from dealing with consultants in starched kaftans, who spent more time complimenting her office decor than reading the complex engineering blueprints. Emeka Okoro was not one of those superficial men. That much was clear the moment he stepped onto the half-finished platform in work boots that had clearly seen a decade of hard use. He crouched beside a concrete support pillar, examined the structure with narrowed eyes, and told her, directly and bluntly, that the load calculations for the eastern wing were completely wrong. They were errors severe enough to cost the company tens of billions of naira if construction continued without an immediate review. Adesewa was initially irritated, unaccustomed to being corrected so frankly by a man she had never met, especially in an environment dominated by men who tended to underestimate her. However, within an hour of cross-referencing his numbers with reports from her own trusted engineers, she realized he was absolutely right. He hadn't known who she was when he walked onto that wet platform, and his demeanor didn't change one bit after he finally learned the powerful surname she carried. There was something in the way he spoke that stayed with her long after that first meeting, a genuine simplicity that seemed almost foreign in boardrooms, built on flattery and ego. He didn't soften his findings to protect her pride, didn't apologize for being right, and there was an inexplicable relief in that, for a woman who had spent her entire career surrounded by people seeking only her financial approval. She found herself replaying the conversation in her mind as she drove home through the Lagos traffic, remembering the particular way he had tapped the blueprint with 2 fingers, as if the numbers themselves were coming to life and speaking for him. It wasn't a sudden, overwhelming attraction, not yet, but it was the seed of something profound she couldn't quite name. It was a growing curiosity about a man who seemed entirely unimpressed by her title or the weight of her bank account. Over the following months, something much quieter and stronger than a simple Nollywood romance took root between them, built on small, everyday things rather than grand, eloquent declarations. There were weekly dinners at a simple buka near the railway yard, where absolutely no one recognized either of them, where the beer was always cold and the jollof rice was infinitely better than it had any right to be. They did site inspections at dawn, when the thick Harmattan haze still clung to the steel tracks and their breath formed white clouds in the cool morning air. There were long, honest conversations that had nothing to do with profit margins or stock prices, and everything to do with the kind of life each of them truly wanted to build. He told her about his daughter Chiamaka's science fair projects, with the same seriousness and attention to detail he gave to the structural tolerances of a steel bridge, and Adesewa found herself laughing more freely than she had in years. The chronic tension she normally carried in her shoulders inside boardrooms would dissipate somewhere between the plates of pepper soup and their quiet talks. Emeka told her he had once founded a small engineering firm and now lived off consulting work and a handful of investments. This was true in the same way that a single brick is a true part of an entire mansion. He never lied to her. He simply never mentioned that a massive holding company called Enyimba Consolidated answered solely and exclusively to him. There were quieter moments, too, that anchored Adesewa's heart in a way she had never experienced. Nights when she sat at his kitchen table sorting through paperwork while Chiamaka practiced piano scales in the next room. It was the ordinary, comforting music of a real life, an existence that had nothing to do with corporate mergers, greedy shareholders, or suffocating family expectations. She began to notice small details about him that a casual observer would miss, like the way he always double-checked that the gas cylinder was turned off before bed, or the careful patience in his voice when Chiamaka called from her university with a problem that seemed huge to a teenager, but minuscule to the rest of the world. It was a kind of emotional stability and security Adesewa had never found within her own family, where love and acceptance always seemed to come with heavy conditions attached. When the dry season began to give way to the rains, Adesewa was officially invited to the annual Balogun family anniversary party, an event that was less a celebration and more a brutal display of power and influence. Her father, Chief Balogun, made it perfectly clear in a sharp, clipped phone call that he expected her to bring the man who was, in his words, distracting her from her real corporate responsibilities. Emeka understood immediately that the invitation was not extended with any warmth or genuine desire to know him. He accepted anyway, without hesitation, because he refused to let Adesewa walk into that oppressive mansion and face her family's sharp judgment alone. Besides, somewhere beneath his unshakable calm, there was a quiet curiosity about what kind of cruel people had raised a woman as sharp, fair, and decent as she was. The night before the Grand Owambe, Emeka stood in his cluttered home office, architectural plans spread across a rustic wooden table, the sound of Chiamaka's laughter floating in from the kitchen. The comforting smell of a simmering stew snaked through the house, creating an atmosphere of peace that contrasted with the approaching storm. The phone rang. He answered a crucial call about Enyimba Consolidated's plan to renew a substantial credit line for the Balogun Logistics Group, a move that would keep Adesewa's family company breathing. He listened intently to the report, then told the voice on the other end not to sign a single document yet, holding the decision with an iron grip. "I want to see how they treat someone," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the night outside, when they firmly believe that someone has no power at all. The Balogun estate was hidden behind immense wrought iron gates and nearly a kilometer of meticulously trimmed hibiscus hedges, the kind of place that made visitors lower their voices without being told. The mansion looked, from the winding driveway, like something built to be on the cover of an architectural magazine rather than a welcoming family home. Fountains glistened like liquid gold under the twilight illumination, while valets in identical uniforms drove imported luxury cars toward a hidden car park at the back. Emeka arrived driving his old Toyota Hilux, the one with a dent in the tailgate from when he'd transported timber to rebuild a community center 2 years prior. The engine made a rough sound as it idled, the way it always did on cooler nights. The head of security at the main gate gave a single, dismissive glance at his worn jacket and the dusty pickup and immediately directed him to the service entrance, reserved strictly for caterers, plumbers, and servers. The guard was absolutely certain that no genuine, respectable guest of the Baloguns would arrive in such a vehicle. Inside, Funke intercepted the guest list before Adesewa could get to the door and handed Emeka a plastic contractor's badge instead of a VIP guest pass, calling it an easy mistake to make. When Adesewa protested, her eyes flashing with anger, Funke's tone was light and pleasant in a sadistic way that made the insult hit its mark with even greater force. She held out the badge with 2 perfectly manicured fingers, as if she couldn't bear the thought of her hand touching his. It wasn't a logistical error. It was a clear message, delivered with a smile sharp enough to draw blood. Adesewa rushed to meet him at the gate, furious and humiliated by the cheap plastic badge now resting in his hand. But Emeka simply folded it, tucked it into his jacket pocket, and told her with unshakable serenity that it didn't matter at all. He hadn't come there to show off a title printed on a piece of plastic. He squeezed her hand once, a small, firm gesture meant to calm her rather than himself, before they walked together through the massive double doors. Inside, the air smelled of fresh lilies and old money, a scent Adesewa had known since childhood and had never questioned until she watched Emeka take it all in. His jaw was tight, his eyes moving calmly over a room that was clearly designed for the sole purpose of reminding visitors of their inferior place in it. Musicians playing traditional string instruments filled the hall with a gentle melody near the far wall, and waiters in pristine white gloves glided between clusters of guests who turned almost in unison to judge the newcomer. Everyone wanted to study the man in the worn jacket who dared to stand beside the powerful MD of the family. In the immense ballroom, under crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people's houses, Funke began her interrogation, disguised as harmless small talk. Every question that left her painted lips was a small blade aimed directly at Emeka's composure. She asked how much he made in a year of hard work, which face me I face you neighborhood he called home, and if he was secretly hoping Adesuwa would one day pay for his daughter's school fees. She even asked if he understood that the watch on Chief Balogun's wrist was worth considerably more than the pickup he'd had the audacity to arrive in. A waiter passed elegantly with a silver tray full of champagne flutes. Funke took two, handing one to her brother and keeping the other, offering nothing to Emeka. It was a small, casual cruelty, executed so naturally it barely registered as intentional. Though Adesewa caught the venom and felt her own jaw tighten in outrage, Emeka answered each invasive question without showing the slightest sign of irritation, explaining politely that Chiamaka had her own guaranteed education fund and that he had never asked Adesewa for a single naira in his life. His unshakable calm only sharpened Funke's contempt. Soon she began introducing him to the wealthy investors in the room as the quaint man who fixes railways, tilting her head as if the very phrase were an unforgivable insult, suggesting to anyone who would listen that Adesewa was just going through a rebellious phase. The tension in the hall reached its peak when Chief Balogun demanded his daughter clarify the true nature of their relationship in front of all the assembled guests. When Adesewa, her head held high, confirmed in a loud, clear voice that Emeka was the man with whom she intended to build a future, the entire room fell into absolute silence. It was that particular kind of dense silence that only old money and deep-seated prejudice can produce, made of polished surfaces and mute judgment. Seizing the collective shock, Funke suddenly produced a leather-bound folder she had clearly prepared days in advance. Inside was a revised trust fund resolution that would divest Adesewa of her entire inheritance, under the bureaucratic pretense of conduct detrimental to the family's immaculate reputation. Chief Balogun delivered his ultimatum without a shadow of hesitation, his deep voice echoing easily over the string quartet, which had abruptly stopped playing, afraid to interrupt the drama. "End this tonight," he said with the authority of an emperor, "or lose absolutely everything that carries the prestigious Balogun name." Adesewa turned immediately to Emeka, searching his face for some sign of what he wanted her to do, some permission or apology. But he offered no plea, no argument in his own defense, only a silent firmness that demanded nothing from her. She almost expected him to speak up for himself, to list his merits as any other man cornered in that room would surely do. But he simply held her gaze, allowing the silence to stretch painfully until the decision to fill it belonged to her alone. "Don't choose this for me," he said finally, his voice low but perfectly audible. "Choose the life you can live with when you look back on this night." The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the dramatic tears or unconditional surrender that everyone there assumed must come from a woman raised within those silk-lined walls of privilege. Adesewa, however, turned back to her father and told him, in a voice that did not tremble for a fraction of a second, that she would never hand over the direction of her life to a document drafted by people who had never once asked what she truly wanted. The harsh, scratching sound of the luxury fountain pen against the thick paper seemed absurdly loud in the funereal silence of the room, with every guest watching, as if witnessing a historic event they would recount at dinner parties for years to come. Chief Balogun signed the resolution right there, his pen moving with the finality of a man who believed he was saving his family's legacy, rather than dismantling his own home. Funke, unable to contain her poisonous joy, read the consequences aloud, with visible satisfaction. She listed the inheritance valued at around 500 billion naira, future voting shares in the Balogun Group, the free use of all family properties scattered around the world, the prestigious seat on a charity board, and threatened to cut every line of financial support the family had ever extended to her. Some guests chuckled quietly behind their champagne flutes, absolutely certain that a woman raised in such luxury would come crawling back for forgiveness the moment she understood what an ordinary life without perks really cost. Funke approached Emeka as the crowd began to disperse and told him with a sneer that Adesewa had just traded an empire for a man who couldn't even afford to buy the room they were standing in. Emeka looked at the woman without a trace of anger and replied mildly that she was confusing inherited money with the true ability to create value, a crucial distinction he suspected she'd never had to learn. Funke shot back with the practiced condescension of someone who had spent a lifetime mistaking cruelty for intelligence, stating that poor men always talked about moral value when they had nothing else to offer. Adesewa left the vast estate with Emeka that same night. No one moved a muscle to stop her, because Chief Balogun was certain that in less than a week she would return, crying for her name back. By midnight, Funke had already leaked a malicious, distorted version of events to the gossip blogs, describing Emeka as an unemployed, parasitic single father who was exploiting a young, vulnerable heiress. She carefully selected the media outlets most likely to publish the story without asking hard questions. By the next morning, shares in the Balogun Logistics Group had plummeted on the market due to strong rumors of family instability, with financial analysts openly speculating about the company's leadership on morning news shows. Neither Adesewa nor Emeka had any desire to turn on the television to watch the circus. Funke immediately used this artificial stock decline to publicly question Adesewa's fitness to lead the company, framing a single, brave personal choice as irrefutable evidence of poor judgment in all professional matters. Emeka offered to resolve all the financial pressure silently, with a single phone call. But Adesewa firmly refused to be rescued so soon after choosing to stand on her own 2 feet. She told him, her eyes shining with determination, that she needed to prove to her father, and above all to herself, that she could protect the company she had built her career on through her own fierce competence, rather than using the resources of the man she loved. Emeka respected that decision far more than he let on, watching her pack heavy files into the boot of a second-hand car, with the same quiet pride he felt watching his daughter Chiamaka study late into the night for her final exams. The next morning, Adesewa opened her email to find a legal notice for an emergency board meeting. The agenda had a single item, the immediate review of her position as managing director. The days that followed moved with a strange, disorienting speed, the kind of confusing blur that comes from watching a life being dismantled piece by piece in front of everyone. Adesewa packed dozens of boxes in the luxurious Eco-Atlantic apartment she had lived in for years, surprised by how little of the place truly felt like it belonged to her. Once she started separating what was from the family trust from what was legitimately hers, she found herself lingering over small things. A chipped mug her late mother had given her, a faded photograph from a company retreat, simple objects that suddenly seemed like the only concrete proof of a life she was allowed to keep. She was forced to vacate the family apartment in a matter of days. Funke made sure the eviction process was as public and humiliating as possible, sending men in suits to retrieve the luxury car keys, the exclusive club membership cards, and every possession still registered in the Balogun Trust's name. The hungry press ran with the story of a woman blinded by an illusory love, painting Emeka as a vulture circling a fortune he had never earned. The truth was he had never accepted a single kobo from her. Chief Balogun convinced himself in his ivory tower that as soon as the golden privileges of the Balogun name vanished, Emeka would vanish along with them like a ghost. Funke went even further, hiring a private investigator to track every kobo Emeka spent, hoping to find proof that he was quietly draining Adesewa's few remaining resources. The investigator's report, when it finally landed on Funke's mahogany desk weeks later, contained nothing but modest utility bills, on-time payments for his daughter's school fees from an account no one had thought to trace carefully, and a routine life that gave her no ammunition at all. Still, she refused to let the absence of proof slow her destructive march. The new flat Adesewa, rented in Surulere, was nothing like any place she had ever lived. It had paper-thin walls, an old air conditioner that made metallic noises at odd hours of the night, and a single living room window that overlooked a grey concrete car park instead of perfectly manicured gardens. And yet, to her own surprise, she found herself sleeping better there than she had in years of luxury. Instead of abandoning her, Emeka helped Adesewa arrange the furniture in the small space near the company headquarters. He cooked dinner most nights on a stove that occasionally forgot how to light, and sat beside her for hours on end, poring over piles of financial documents to prepare her for the fateful board meeting that could end her career. There was something almost cozy and purely domestic about the chaotic arrangement. Takeaway containers piled near the sink, papers filled with charts spread across a second-hand table, the two of them working in comfortable silence long after midnight, as the air conditioner marked its irregular rhythm against the peeling wall. Chiamaka, Emeka's daughter, called one night from her dormitory at the University of Ibadan. The young woman's face was lit by the pale glow of her laptop screen, thick books stacked precariously behind her on a narrow desk. She simply asked if Adesewa was holding up under the pressure and reminded her with a gentle smile that there would always be a place for her at the Okoro family table. There was an easy, sincere warmth in the girl's voice, the same unshakable stability Adesewa had come to recognize and love in her father. For a precious moment, the crushing weight on Adesewa's chest eased slightly, replaced by something that felt very much like belonging to a real home. While meticulously reviewing the transport division's financial statements late one night, the apartment silent, except for the hum of the AC, Adesewa noticed a glaring anomaly. There was a merger proposal being quietly advanced behind the scenes with Adecol Merchant Bank, a clever maneuver that, if successful, would strip the Balogun Group of control over several of its most valuable freight corridors. She read the obscure clause twice, rubbed her tired eyes, and read it a third time, certain she had misinterpreted the legal jargon. Then the full shape of the coup her Aunt Funke was orchestrating fell on her like a bucket of ice water. At almost the same time she made this frightening discovery, a discreet private investment fund called Enyimba Consolidated Holdings began to massively buy up Balogun Group bonds, which the panicked market was offloading at rock-bottom prices. Funke received an urgent report naming Enyimba as the company's newest and largest creditor in a matter of weeks. But not a single senior analyst on her vast team could identify who actually controlled the mountain of cash behind the purchases. Arrogant as ever, Funke dismissed the mystery as irrelevant, blindly certain that no anonymous investor could threaten a master plan she had spent years building in the shadows. That absolute certainty would soon prove to be the first and most devastating real mistake she had made in her entire campaign of sabotage. To make matters worse, Funke relentlessly pressured the banks that financed the Balogun Group's daily operations. She engineered an artificial liquidity crisis that threatened to suspend a critical credit line the company desperately depended on to pay employee salaries and fuel suppliers. Funke's intention was simple, cruel, and merciless: to manufacture an internal crisis so severe that the board would have no choice but to accept the merger with Adecol Bank as the only viable path to corporate survival. The livelihoods of thousands of employees were at stake. Mr. Dio, a veteran warehouse manager who had always respected Adesewa's leadership, watched with dread as scheduling boards threatened to go blank in a matter of hours. Truck drivers and dock workers had no idea their next paychecks were hanging by a thread, dependent on a decision being made by wealthy people in a room where none of them would ever set foot. Panic was beginning to set in on the factory floor, with whispers of mass layoffs running through the maintenance garages. It was at this moment of near collapse that the situation took a turn no one, least of all Funke, could have predicted. With only hours to go before the deadline, Enyimba Consolidated Holdings unexpectedly extended a massive new financing package and personally guaranteed every pending payment to suppliers, pulling the company back from the brink of the abyss. The news shot through the entire company like a long-held breath finally being released. Supervisors like Mr. Dio relayed the good news down the chain of command to the loading docks, where no one understood exactly who had saved their jobs and guaranteed the food on their families' tables. They only knew that someone powerful had done it. Funke immediately called the press to declare, in a tone of manufactured outrage, that Enyimba was preparing a hostile takeover of the company. But Adesewa wasn't so quick to believe her aunt's lies. Reading the terms of the new financing agreement herself, Adesewa found robust protections written specifically to safeguard hourly workers, plus an ironclad clause explicitly forbidding the use of any company assets to secure loans connected to Adecol Bank. The surgical precision of the legal language felt strangely familiar to her, in a way she couldn't immediately place. The contract was structured with an engineer's deep understanding of how transit systems actually worked under extreme pressure. When she asked Emeka, looking him in the eye, if he had any obscure connection to that fund, he calmly admitted he knew some important people within Enyimba, Consolidated but held back from telling her the entire, overwhelming truth of his own involvement. He made only one thing clear before she could press him further. He had no intention of using money to control her life, and Enyimba had intervened only to stop Funke from destroying the company before the board could see the hidden truth. Mrs. Ijoma Eze, the company's longtime chief financial officer, a woman with a stern demeanor and unquestionable loyalty to Adesewa, helped her dig deep through years of internal records and dusty archives. Together, they discovered tens of billions of naira that had been quietly diverted from the Balogun Group to phantom consulting firms with direct ties to the Adecol family. The pattern of corruption stretched far beyond what either of them had imagined in their worst nightmares. There were invoices issued for services that had clearly never been rendered, and multi-million naira monthly retainers paid to companies that had no verifiable employees or even physical offices. The two women worked late into the night for several nights in a row, with complex spreadsheets spread across the table, like crucial evidence at a crime scene. Mrs. Easy's reading glasses were pushed up on her head, holding back her graying hair, as she traced the dirty money trails through years of manipulated tax filings. There was a particular satisfaction, mixed with revulsion, in watching a clear pattern emerge from what had once seemed like mere accounting chaos. Invoice after invoice, shell company after shell company, the entire money trail pointed firmly and without deviation in the same direction. Funke, Mrs. Ise, who had spent 2 decades protecting the integrity of that company's books with a fierce, unglamorous loyalty, didn't bother to hide her palpable fury when the full picture finally became clear. Her pen tapped sharply against the wooden table each time she uncovered another falsified item, feeling the betrayal cut deeper than simple professional indignation. Sitting across from Mrs. Ise in that small, makeshift conference room cluttered with printed papers, Adesewa finally understood the true nature of the monster her aunt had created. Taking her inheritance had never, at any point, been about protecting the family's moral reputation or disapproving of her relationship. It was all a calculated maneuver to remove Adesewa's voting power before the board could see a power grab that had been designed in the shadows for years, and Emeka's fortune, whatever its true size, had simply arrived in time to throw a wrench in the gears of that Machiavellian plan. Feeling the pressure mounting, Funke made one last, desperate offer before the board could convene. She promised Adesewa her full inheritance back, without a single kobo missing, on the condition that she publicly end her relationship with Emeka, voluntarily resign as MD, and declare full support for the merger with Aid Coal Bank in front of all major shareholders. That indecent proposal told Adesewa everything she needed to know about her aunt's corrupted priorities. Emeka had never been the real target, just a convenient excuse disguised as a moral objection. It was the perfect cover for a corporate theft scheme that was in motion long before Emeka ever crossed Adesewa's path on that train platform. Adesewa refused the offer without batting an eye. Her voice remained firm and icy, even as her hands trembled slightly under the table. Funke's arrogant expression faltered for just a second, surprise briefly breaking her porcelain composure before the mask of disdain slid back into place. Feeling cornered, Funke responded within hours, leaking a grotesquely distorted story about Emeka's first company, claiming in the papers that he had sold it in a panic during a financial collapse, and publicly labeling him a failed entrepreneur living off the scraps of his own ruin. The tension was at a breaking point. The night before the decisive board meeting, Emeka picked up Adesewa and took her to an unmarked office located above a small mechanical engineering workshop in Ikeja, a place she had passed dozens of times without ever noticing. There, surrounded by old drafting boards and unfinished models of bridge supports, the smell of machine oil and fresh sawdust hanging in the air, Emeka told her everything he had been carrying in secret since the night they met. He revealed that he was the founder, creator, and absolute controlling owner of Enyimba Consolidated Holdings, a colossal private corporation with majority stakes in dry ports, interstate railways, energy infrastructure, and cutting-edge logistics technology spanning half the country. His first engineering company hadn't failed at all, as Funke had spread. On the contrary, it had become the foundational technology for freight network systems used across dozens of states. He held most of his shares through a bulletproof family trust, established shortly after the tragic death of his wife. His personal, non-transferable fortune hovered around a staggering 7.8 trillion naira. This entire empire had been kept almost entirely out of the arrogant public's view through a complex legal structure of companies most people would never think to question. Adesewa listened to the entire confession without interrupting him once. The absurd numbers washed over her like something purely abstract, a corporate language she professionally mastered but never, in her wildest dreams, expected to hear applied to the humble man sitting across from her. Raphael, Emeka's extremely trusted personal assistant at Enyimba, entered the room silently, placed the heavy final reports on the project table, and left without a word, giving a respectful nod. Somewhere in the back of the workshop, an old radio played softly, forgotten static under the crushing weight of what he was revealing to her. Adesewa watched his hands as he spoke calmly. The same calloused, grease-stained, careful hands that had adjusted blueprints on that first rainy platform. She found it strange and fascinating that they belonged to a man capable of moving entire markets and dictating the course of the economy with a simple signature on a piece of paper. He explained, his voice thick with memory, that after losing his wife to a swift illness, he had withdrawn entirely from public life and the spotlight of wealth. He wanted to raise Chiamaka alone, in an environment of normalcy, choosing to return to hands-on engineering and the dust of construction sites, rather than lock himself in glass-walled boardrooms and issue empty press releases. He hadn't hidden his wealth out of shame, but because he flatly refused to allow every genuine relationship in his life to be silently re-evaluated and corrupted the exact moment people discovered what he was really worth. Adesewa sat with the weight of that revelation for a long moment. The initial shock of the numbers landed somewhere distant in her mind, becoming secondary to the emotional question that truly mattered to her in that instant. She looked deep into his eyes and asked directly if he had feared she would love him differently, or with interest, after discovering the truth about the trillions. Emeka sighed heavily and admitted with disarming honesty that he deeply feared both possible outcomes equally, being loved more intensely because of the money, and being loved less intensely in spite of it. That solitary fear had followed him like a shadow for years, without ever finding an easy or comforting answer. After processing everything, Adesewa decided firmly that his true identity would be revealed to the board only when corporate law demanded it. Until then, she would face Funke in that boardroom on her own strength and on her own terms. That same night, Funke triumphantly announced to her allies that she already had all the votes needed to oust Adesewa from her position first thing in the morning. When the sun rose, the board gathered inside the imposing glass building where the Balogun family had once laughed at the man in a contractor's badge. Funke opened the session with a passionate speech. She portrayed Adesewa as a mentally unstable executive, claiming her disastrous personal choices had destroyed shareholder confidence beyond repair. Chief Balogun stood beside his sister, his expression grim, convinced that sacrificing his own daughter's career was the only painful path left to save the company his father had built with his sweat. The boardroom was freezing. In that particular way, air conditioning always seemed to operate during high-stakes meetings. The long mahogany table gleamed like a dark mirror, with untouched glasses of water sweating in front of each chair. Adesewa sat with her spine perfectly straight, her hands clasped in her lap, refusing to let anyone there see how much her future depended on the next hour. Just as the crucial vote was about to begin, the double doors swung open, and Emeka entered the room. He introduced himself as an official, accredited representative of Enyimba Consolidated Holdings. He was wearing the exact same worn jacket and the same boots he had on the night they had mercilessly humiliated him at the party. Funk, her face red with indignation, immediately ordered security to remove him from the building by force. But he simply ignored the guards, placed a heavy binder of documents on the mahogany table, and declared, without raising his voice a single decibel, exactly what Enyimba Consolidated now controlled. The perfectly bound documents showed that he owned the overwhelming majority of the Balogun Group's circulating corporate bonds, as well as absolute veto power over any transaction that altered the company's assets. They also detailed a strategic and massive accumulation of shares legally purchased over several years, and the irrevocable right to cancel the licensing of all core logistics technology if the company was sold or merged without proper authorization. The company's legal counsel spent nearly 20 excruciating minutes reviewing every page of the documents in a sepulchral silence, while the rest of the room sweated with tension. Finally, the head lawyer swallowed hard and confirmed aloud that every document was absolutely and frighteningly legitimate, from the first signature to the last, with every notary seal exactly where it needed to be to have the unquestionable force of law. Desperate and losing control of the narrative, Funke insisted, shouting that he was merely a low-level employee acting on behalf of some invisible billionaire. It was then that Emeka walked slowly to the end of the table and turned the papers to the last page. There, the name of the beneficial and absolute controlling owner of Enyimba Consolidated Holdings was printed in bold capital letters, Emeka Okoro. The boardroom plunged into a silence even heavier and more suffocating than the one at the party months before. Chief Balogun turned pale, finally understanding with a sudden terror that the modest man he had dismissed as unworthy and useless single-handedly controlled a fortune that dwarfed almost everything the Balogun dynasty had taken generations to build. Emeka didn't smile arrogantly, and he didn't gloat, though anyone in the room would have forgiven him if he had. His voice remained as calm and controlled as it had been on the night. Funke cornered him with cruel questions. "You judged me by the old pickup I drove," he said, looking directly into Chief Balogun's frightened eyes. "And that is the exact same ruler you use to judge all your employees, your loyal suppliers, and any human being who cannot make you even richer than you already are." He paused, letting the weight of the truth sink in. "That is not a winning business philosophy," he added softly. "It is just contempt wearing an expensive coat." Funke, stubbornly refusing to surrender so easily to the man she repudiated, slammed her hands on the table and argued, her voice shrill, that his vast wealth changed nothing. She yelled that she still held enough votes among the corrupted board members to tear Adesewa from her position, regardless of which billionaire was standing beside her. It was at that exact moment that Adesewa stood up, taking control of the room. With relentless clarity, she presented the explosive and detailed dossier she and Mrs. Eze had spent painful weeks assembling. She methodically exposed, page by page, how Funke had systematically and criminally undervalued essential company assets, redirected multi-million naira contracts to Adecole family shell companies, fabricated the liquidity crisis to cause terror, used the inheritance dispute as a dirty weapon to steal control, and prepared the ground to sell off vital transport corridors at ridiculous prices. Adesewa's testimony carried the irrefutable weight of someone who had dedicated decades of sweat and tears to protecting that corporation from exactly this type of corporate parasite. Several board members squirmed uncomfortably in their padded leather chairs as she walked them slowly through each grotesquely falsified invoice. Mrs. Eze, steady as a rock, confirmed under oath that all those rotten transactions had been deliberately concealed from the company's independent audit committee, forming a clear and undeniable pattern impossible to label as coincidence. With no way out, Funke tried one last, irrational attack, screaming accusations that Emeka had orchestrated a hostile takeover disguised as generosity. But Emeka ended the debate by presenting his recapitalization offer for all to see. Enyimba Consolidated would not demand the CEO's chair, would not cut a single job at the docks or in the offices, and would not ask Adesewa to transfer a single share to his name. The only demands were that the board add truly independent members, that Funke be immediately suspended and investigated, and that all Adecole transactions undergo criminal scrutiny. He read each term without flourish, his eyes seeking Adesewa's only once, to reaffirm that he was not buying her future, but rather freeing her from Funke's suffocating trap. It became clear to everyone that Emeka had no interest in dominating Adesewa, but only in protecting the woman he loved and the thousands of families who depended on that company. Sylvia, one of the oldest and most respected board members, who until then had been blinded by Funke's manipulation, was the first to speak. Her voice trembling with shame, she declared she was changing her vote immediately, unable to close her eyes to the abyss of corruption that had been exposed. One by one, hands that would have risen without hesitation for Funke remained down, inert on the table. Men and women in expensive suits rapidly recalculated where their loyalty needed to point to save their own skins. Chief Balogun was forced to swallow the bitter truth that, in punishing his daughter, he had almost handed the keys to the empire to the woman who was dismantling his legacy. By the end of the vote, the merger with the bank was aborted. Funke was stripped of all her powers, and Adesewa's leadership was secured. The financial journalists scrambled to correct their hasty reports. Funke was expelled from the building that same day, the sound of her expensive heels echoing on a marble floor that no longer belonged to her. The next day, Chief Balogun went personally to Emeka's modest workshop. He was awkward, surprised to find the billionaire, still in that simple jacket, fixing an old machine instead of ruling from a skyscraper. The chief offered to return Adesewa's full inheritance, begging for forgiveness. But Adesewa, who arrived shortly after, refused the easy way out. She mandated that the family trust now be managed by independent agents, that part of the fortune directly fund the workers' pension funds, and that her father publicly admit his grotesque error. Seeing his daughter's unyielding determination, Chief Balogun understood she had not fought for money, but for justice and moral integrity to protect people like Mr. Dio and all the employees at the loading docks. When the humbled patriarch asked if Emeka was satisfied being richer than all of them combined, Emeka replied softly that his bank account had nothing to prove. "I just needed you to understand," Emeka said, "that your daughter never became poor on the day she chose me." 6 months later, the docks were operating with new vigor, and the corporate environment had been cleansed of the past's venom. And a year after it all, at the same annual family party, Emeka walked across the hall wearing the exact same worn jacket. The silence that fell over the guests was no longer one of malicious mockery, but of reverence and awe. Adesewa walked up to him, her heels clicking on the dark marble, and took his hand in front of the same people who had once looked down on him. No one there would dare call him a fortune hunter again. Those who had laughed the hardest at his simplicity now pretended to study the bottom of their glasses, lacking the courage to meet his eyes. Chief Balogun watched his daughter smile, with a lightness he hadn't seen in decades. In that frank look between father and daughter, under the city lights twinkling outside through the large glass panels, it was clear that a person's true wealth can never be calculated in digits or bank statements. A person's worth is measured by the courage to be authentic in a world of illusions, by the strength to defend what is right when wrongdoing seems more profitable, and by the ability to love without looking at the price of clothes or the circumstances of birth. They discovered at the end of life's journey that fortunes crumble, alliances of interest break, and luxury loses its seductive shine. But peace of mind and the respect earned through integrity are treasures that no greed can steal. They learned that the most miserable are those who use gold to measure feelings, and that the greatest freedom anyone can achieve is the sacred right to choose to walk beside someone who sees their soul, not their bank balance. And so, freed from the invisible chains of presumption, the two could finally find pure love and true peace.